All right, guys, welcome back to our ongoing discussion of the catabolic breakdown of carbohydrates, specifically glucose, through this really essential core pathway of glycolysis. And just as a reminder of where we were from the last time, recall that we had taken glucose, right, which we brought in as this closed ring pyranose monosaccharide, right? And we went through a series of 5 steps involving some phosphorylation, and isomerization, then another phosphorylation, right, to get us down to this furanose version of this sugar, um, which is this 5-membered ring that had 2 of the alcohol groups on those carbons phosphorylated, right? So here over at the 1 carbon, and again over here at the 6 carbon, right? To, of course, again, if we were up here, we had glucose to start. All right, and now we've come down here through 3 steps, 2 phosphorylation events and an isomerization event that converted glucose into fructose. And with the 2 sugars, excuse me, the 2 phosphates on there, we of course have fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. And then we saw how this reaction, this molecule was then worked upon by aldolase, this next reaction that split the bond between that 3 and 4 carbon to give us these 2 3-carbon triose sugars, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, right? Cap, right? And this not so useful ketone, dihydroxyacetone phosphate. All right, okay. And we saw how, of course, through a simple tautomerization reaction, we can convert DHAP into GAP through a simple tautomerization. Via the enzyme triose phosphate isomerase, right? Okay, so those are our first 5 steps. That got us through the sort of key part of putting on a couple of phosphates and doing the thing that this pathway is ultimately named for, which is the splitting of sugar, the lysis of glucose, all right? Okay, so at this point, what we've got in principle is a bunch of this stuff that is now gonna flow down the rest of this pathway, right? The remainder of glycolysis, and out of this, we're gonna get 4 ATPs, all right? And we're gonna get 2 reduced NADHs, right? By the time we get all the way into our endpoint, which is of course pyruvate, right? All right. So let's jump on in and see how this works, right? So if the triose phosphate isomerase reaction in my nomenclature was the 5th reaction, that brings us to reaction 6, which is a really important reaction in this pathway. Well, they're all important, right? But this one is really key on a lot of different levels. All right, so reaction 6 of glycolysis, we're going to take glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, we're going to take some oxidized NAD, right? We're going to take a little inorganic phosphate, right? And we're going to run an oxidatively coupled phosphorylation reaction that is going to generate our first high energy acyl phosphate compound, which is, of course, this guy. 1,3-bis. Oops, I screwed up. I dropped a phosphate group. Oh, sorry about that, guys. All right, because this is, of course, GAP. This is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So we're going to create our first high energy phosphate, acyl phosphate group here in 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Or 1,3-BPG, as it's also known, right? Plus, of course, some reduced NAD in the form of NADH, right? The enzyme that runs this reaction is, of course, the well-known glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Otherwise known as GAPDH. Right? And the GAPDH reaction, again, running with a theme you've seen before several times, the standard state for energy change for the what is going on with you? Oh, right, using the wrong tool. The standard state for energy change for the GAPDH reaction is one of these not so favorable 6.3 kilojoule per mole reactions, right? So you're sensing a theme here that under cellular conditions, with the way in which this reaction is pulled by depletion of the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate pool, we can make this unfavorable reaction, thermodynamically unfavorable reaction, we can pull it in the direction of glycolytic flux by depleting the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate pools, and we can just tip this over at negative 1.7 kilojoules per mole under cellular conditions. Okay, now, like I said, this reaction, the GAPDH reaction, is a really important reaction. We're going to dwell on it a little bit because this becomes kind of a focal point for thinking about how energy balance works under a couple of different really important conditions, right? So it's really important to get your head around this reaction. So the first thing I've already sort of pointed out, this is the first creation of a high energy acyl phosphate group. Because remember that 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, right? We talked about that as one of those compounds that has a higher phosphotransfer potential even than ATP, right? Okay, so maybe you can sense where this is going. We're going to use that phosphate group to make some ATP, right? We've also created our first molecule of a reduced high energy electron carrier, right? So those electrons that we essentially sucked out of that aldehyde group, we just stuffed over here into NADH, and we've preserved most of their free energy relative to their state in that reduced aldehyde when we stuffed them into NADH, and those are going to then be useful later on, right? Okay, now like I said, the GAPDH reaction is essentially, we're essentially powering the formation of that high energy acyl phosphate group, right? We're going to see why it's high, how we do this in a second, by driving this with this oxidation reaction, right? That's how we're going to sort of pump this baby up. Okay, so let's take a look at this enzyme, GAPDH, and some of the elements of how this enzyme works, right? It's kind of important. All right, so I'm going to skip on over, right? So this is one of the isoforms of GAPDH. I can't remember if this is the bacterial Doesn't matter. They're very, very homologous, right? Here's the basic form of the enzyme. It's got a couple of lobes, right? We'll talk about this one here in a second. Two different lobes. Here's the active site of the enzyme. Right down here in the active site, there is the NADH, right? Here's a blow up of the key residue. So that's that critical prosthetic group we're going to need, or substrate we're going to need to drive this reaction. And there are two key residues in the active site of GAPDH. There's a cysteine residue and a histidine residue. Notice they're all very close together right near that NAD plus molecule. That's going to become really super important, where this ring is positioned relative to that cysteine, right? Okay. Now, just as another quick reminder, you might, if you look at this really carefully, you might recognize that fold. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the class when we were talking about some of the categories of basic protein structure, right? That domain, the molecule, the domain specifically that binds to the NADH, recognize that 7-stranded parallel beta sheet flanked by this pair of alpha helices. That's, of course, a Rossmann fold, right? Though the fold recognized by Michael Rossmann, the only fold which gets a person's name attached to it, right? The Rossmann fold either evolved to be, or was co-opted to be, or is just used a lot by evolution to bind nicotinamide adenine dinucleotides, right? This is an incredibly common fold in dehydrogenase and reductase enzymes that bind NADH or NAD in NAD+, right? So you see this fold over and over and over again. It's a great way, or extremely effective way to bind this nucleotide cofactor and or substrate molecule and position it for the kind of chemistry that we're going to see here in just a second. All right. Now the GAPDH mechanism essentially involves 2 steps, right? This enzyme is basically going to go we're going to take GAP, right? And then we're going to create an intermediate, right, on the enzyme, right? Essentially going to create a thioester intermediate on the enzyme. So we're going to see some covalent chemistry, covalent catalysis here, right? And then we're going to resolve that to make 1,3 bis phosphoglycerate and regenerate the enzyme, right? So it's a 2-step reaction and it looks something like this. So here we are in the active site of the enzyme. There's that oxidized NAD+. Here's that active site cysteine, and there's that histidine residue. We're going to do a combo of covalent chemistry and acid-base chemistry coupled to electron flow in a redox reaction that sort of staples this thing in place, that drives the reaction downhill ultimately, right? And here, let's just imagine there's the aldehyde chunk of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate right in the active site. It's designed to bind very close to that cysteine, right? So that thiol group is perfectly positioned for a nucleophilic attack on that carbonyl group to form this so-called hemithioacetal group, right? Which is essentially like a sulfur adduct with the carbon, and there's an alcohol group there. Now that's really unstable, right? What this molecule really wants to do is that alcohol group wants to decay right back to where it was, right? And return, well, he's gonna do it to me again. I gotta keep my arm off the slide apparently. That alcohol group really wants to just, sort of pop back down, reform that carbonyl. And in the absence of somewhere for those electrons to go, all that's going to happen is the electrons between that carbon sulfur bond are going to pop right back over to that hydrogen and reform the thiol, right? So this is an eminently reversible reaction, wouldn't be stable at all, except for the fact the electrons have somewhere else to go. That's what that oxidized NADH right down there next to that thiol provides. And by also providing a little base catalysis where this histidine helps abstract that proton, right, from that hemiacetal, right, and help drive those electrons back into reform that carbonyl. But instead of splitting the sulfur thiol bond, the electrons now are much more favorably driven into that waiting, oxidizing potential of that NAD plus group, right? To result in the formation now of reduced NADH and this thioester that is now bound in the active site of the enzyme. We've done a little covalent catalysis and formed that thioester and driven it by having that reducing moiety of that NAD nearby. Now you could say, well, why do that? I mean, why go to all the trouble of making this thioester? And the reason is, what would be the alternative? I mean, the alternative would be if we'd oxidize it down to a carboxylic acid, right? So this is our reactants, remember? We've got energy in that aldehyde. We want to use it to make something useful. Specifically, we want to use it to make a high energy acyl phosphate group. Well, if we oxidized this guy right down to a carboxylic acid, we basically blow all the energy we need, right? The free energy of that carboxylic acid, all right, if we just went straight down, we can't climb back up here to make that acyl enzyme intermediate, right? Make that acyl phosphate group. We've basically blown it, right? We've dissipated all the energy we need. That thioester, by contrast, is not stable, right? Thioesters are readily hydrolyzable molecules, right? This is downhill from the point of view of the aldehyde, but it is still significantly less stable even than the acyl phosphate group we want to form, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want to do. By forming this unstable thioester group, we've preserved the free energy available for ultimately forming an acyl phosphate group, which we then want to use to make some ATP, right? Okay, so to do that, the first thing that has to happen though, is we got to clear the active site of that reduced NADH. So that pops out and it's replaced by an oxidized NAD plus before the next set of the reaction goes. And it's interesting as to why you do that. There's no more oxidation going to happen here, but the positive charge on that NAD plus is thought to provide an electrostatic kick or an little electrostatic catalysis to help stabilize the negative charge that builds up on that carbonyl group. That when you basically run a phosphorylasis reaction, you're going to bring in some inorganic phosphate here, and you're going to use that as a nucleophile to cleave that thioester bond to create this acyl phosphate group. But that transition state there has a lot of negative charge, and it's thought that the positive charge, that NAD plus, helps reduce the free energy, right, of that transition state through some electrostatic catalysis, right? Okay, so that brings us to the end of the GAPDH mechanism, and we've now basically at this point created, right, 2 moles, because remember, right, we run this reaction per glucose molecule, we're going to do it twice, remember, because, oops, remember, we split that glucose molecule in half, right? So we've got 2 of these GAPDH molecules. So per glucose, we run, 2 of these GAP molecules, we run the GAPDH reaction twice, right? So this is like a 2x thing. And you got to think about all these remaining steps through the rest of glycolysis is essentially running 2x per glucose molecule, right? Okay, so at this point, we made 1 ATP, right? We've made we've made 2 moles of 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, all right? The next thing we need to do is get something back, right? And so the next set of reactions show us how we get something back and then make a little profit, right? Okay.